New Hampshire was one of the closest states in the 2016 election, going to Hillary Clinton very narrowly by just a few thousand votes. And yet in 2024, the state, according to polls, really isn't that competitive. Now, there's other key states that Hillary Clinton won back in 2016, Minnesota, Virginia, Nevada, all states now where Donald Trump has the lead in polls. New Hampshire is the outlier. And what's interesting to note is that New Hampshire was the closest out of all of these states back in 2016. And yet now Biden has a 5-point lead in the RCP aggregate of polls. And Donald Trump has only led in one poll in New Hampshire over the last couple of months. Joe Biden has essentially had a very solid lead in the state throughout the entire election cycle. So in this video, we're going to talk about why New Hampshire really isn't going to be that competitive in 2024, and ultimately why the state is moving more towards the Democratic Party. So we're going to talk about New Hampshire politics specifically, and why there are some trends just working against the GOP in the state. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So New Hampshire, as I mentioned, was one of the closest states back in the 2016 election. Donald Trump lost the state by just 0.3%. If we go down to the Senate level, Kelly Ayotte, who was the incumbent Republican senator here, lost by about less than 1,000 votes. An incredibly tight election, but ultimately the Democrat winning here. Now, no Republican for Senate has won in New Hampshire since 2010, and New Hampshire hasn't had a Republican representing it in the House since January of 2017. If we take a look at the party breakdown in New Hampshire for all of the key offices, the only offices occupied by Republicans are sort of the state and local offices. Of course, you have the governor, Chris Sununu, who is a Republican, a bit more of a moderate centrist Republican. And then, of course, you have the legislature occupied by the GOP. But when it comes to congressional seats and federal offices, Democrats control the state and have controlled the state since 2017. Now, New Hampshire historically was a Republican state like the rest of New England. Really starting in the 1990s, like with the rest of New England, New Hampshire started trending more Democratic. It was won by George Bush very narrowly back in 2000, but really since then has consistently backed Democrats for president. And yet, every cycle since 2000, Republicans have always contested New Hampshire as an important swing state, but this time around, that could potentially change. Now, if we go back to the 2022 midterms, this was another cycle where Republicans had some hope of winning a federal office in New Hampshire. You had Don Bolduc, who was sort of this Trump acolyte, going up against Maggie Hassan. And Maggie Hassan wasn't really that popular in the state of New Hampshire. But as the cycle went on and, voters found out Don Bolduc was, sort of outside the mainstream politically for the state, Maggie Hassan ended up winning this race by 9 points, despite polls having this race a lot closer. Now, down ballot, the only election going to Republicans was the governor's seat with Chris Sununu. And again, Chris Sununu is a very different type of Republican. I wouldn't call him necessarily a New England Republican because he does have some conservative stances on issues like guns. He is fiscally conservative, but on more of the social issues, he's a bit more liberal and sort of in line with New Hampshire voters because New Hampshire is more of a liberal, libertarian type state, which makes it a bit different from places like Vermont or Massachusetts, for example, which are solidly in the liberal Democratic category. And this could be one of the reasons why New Hampshire has been more competitive in recent cycles, despite states like Vermont, for example, or Maine not really being all that competitive, because those states just have a different political alignment than New Hampshire. New Hampshire has sort of the live free or die attitude, or at least it used to have. Now, recently, New Hampshire has been changing a bit demographically. A lot of people from Massachusetts have been moving into New Hampshire, and this is sort of being borne out in the election results we're seeing as of late. Now, 23,000 people moved to New Hampshire from Massachusetts in 2022, making up nearly half of all new residents in the entire state. Now, New Hampshire is not a big state. 23,000 people in a state that just has over 1 million people is somewhat significant. And this has been going on for the past few decades, as people from Massachusetts have moved here for lower taxes and generally a cheaper cost of living. But some of those people have taken their politics with them. You also have to account for the fact that New Hampshire is one of the least religious states in the country. And the GOP's sort of evangelical, social conservative branding has become more increasingly unpopular in New Hampshire. It's one of the reasons why Republicans like Chris Sununu can win here, but, Republicans like Mitt Romney, for example, lost, or why Donald Trump lost in 2016 and 2020 here, and just other federal Republicans in general have lost here. Again, Republicans haven't won a House seat in New Hampshire since the 2014 midterms, and both Democrats in 2022 won by over 8 percentage points. So these races really weren't that close. Now, Republicans did nominate a very bad candidate in the 1st Congressional District, Caroline Levitt, who was sort of this MAGA acolyte running as sort of a Trump sycophant. Was running in a district that wasn't really too fond of Donald Trump. Again, this is the state of New Hampshire. This was a state that voted for Joe Biden by 7 points back in 2020. And ultimately, Caroline Levitt lost pretty considerably. So Republicans have sort of blown their chances in New Hampshire. But, that's partly due to the fact that the demographics of this state are changing and the electorate is just getting more liberal. Now, 2020, I think, was really sort of a turning point in New Hampshire politics because normally New Hampshire tends to vote against the party in power when it comes to re-election years for presidents. We saw that in 2004 with John Kerry flipping this state from George Bush in 2000. We saw it in 2012 with Obama losing ground here. And we saw it even in 2016 with Hillary Clinton almost losing the state. But fast forward to 2020, and New Hampshire did stay true to this tradition, but it voted a lot more Democratic than it had in the previous past couple cycles. Joe Biden winning the state by over 7 points is the largest margin for a Democrat in New Hampshire since 2008. So that goes to show you that this was very different than other election years. Now, Minnesota also did have a pretty hard left shift from 2016 to 2020, but the difference in Minnesota is that Trump is polling a lot more competitively than he is in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is just sort of becoming a likely Democratic state when it comes to most offices. And, who knows what's going to happen in the 2024 governor's race because Kristi Noem isn't running for re-election. Kelly Ayo, the former Republican senator here who was voted out incredibly narrowly, as we talked about earlier, is actually running for governor. So that could be an interesting test to see if New Hampshire will stay true to its sort of swing state nature in down ballot races. Because if Kelly Ayo loses by a considerable margin, it could indicate that New Hampshire is just having more of a broader Democratic shift. Now, a silver lining for Republicans in the state is the fact that they can still win in state legislative races. Again, as we talked about, Republicans control the state house and the state senate in New Hampshire. A lot of other states that have turned Democratic, places like Minnesota, for example, Republicans were knocked out of power in the state legislature. We saw that in Virginia after 2019. And again, in 2023, Republicans were knocked out of power once more. Nevada, same thing. Republicans don't control any chamber of the legislature. But New Hampshire is the exception. And I think part of the reason for that is Kristi Noem's coattails, but also because New England politics is a lot more local than other parts of the country. New Hampshire is a small state, both geographically and in terms of its population. So a lot of these local candidates really rely on the sort of human connection in these small town environments, knocking doors, and winning elections that way. Races in New Hampshire are a lot more localized than sort of bigger states like Massachusetts, or even Connecticut, for example, where it's just much more partisan, even on the state level. But going into 2024, I really wouldn't recommend Republicans spend much effort in New Hampshire this time around. I mean, if Donald Trump is polling this well in other battleground states, leading by 5 points in some cases, but losing New Hampshire by 5 points, I think that says something more about the state of New Hampshire sort of shifting more to the left of the national environment than it would have in previous elections, because New Hampshire voted to the right of the national environment in 2016, voted to the left of it in 2020. While New Hampshire does have this tendency to vote against the party in power during re-election years, and you could see Joe Biden lose ground in the state overall, I don't think Trump has a realistic chance of actually flipping the state. And I think that's mainly due to the fact that the demographics in New Hampshire are just against Republicans. You have a higher educated population. You have a more liberal electorate than the rest of the country. Again, a lot of the Republicans running in New Hampshire that win are much more moderate than somebody like Donald Trump, for example. And I think that is really the reason why New Hampshire is not going to be competitive in 2024. Republicans ought to focus on more competitive states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. And even some of these states where Republicans have been polling surprisingly well, Virginia, Minnesota, I would sort of be skeptical of those polls, especially in the state of Virginia, because you're going from a state that voted for Joe Biden by 10 points that's been relatively inelastic over the past decade or so in its politics. Virginia's more broadly just been a blue state. To see it go from Biden plus 10 to Trump plus 1 seems a bit out of character, especially when the key electorates in Virginia, educated suburban voters around the rest of the country, really haven't shown this big shift towards Donald Trump. You've really seen it more with minority voters and in some cases white working class voters in rural areas. So I'm a bit more skeptical of the red shifts that we're seeing in the polls in places like Virginia, Minnesota. I think New Hampshire's polls seem to be fairly accurate as to where the state might potentially vote in 2024. A D+5 victory for Joe Biden wouldn't really be that unexpected and would kind of put the state out of that competitive nature. So overall, I think the reason it won't be invested in too much is because it only has 4 electoral votes. It's not really a big prize, and in the grand scheme of things, it's probably not going to make the difference in the election. I think Republicans ought to stay focused on the Rust Belt, as should the Democrats, if they want to win the election, because that's really where 2024 will be decided. It's likely going to be decided in Wisconsin, potentially in Michigan or Pennsylvania, not New Hampshire. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.